welcome once again to Dialogue on Public Issues. I'm John Channing, host with Campbellsville University. About 30 days before the November 30 election, I was very pleased to host two very distinguished political scientists from Campbellsville University, Dr. Shawn Williams and Dr. Josiah Marineau, to discuss the upcoming, at that time, presidential election and November 3rd election in general. Today, as of the date we're doing this interview, we're approximately 30 days past the November 3rd general election. And it is apparent that we have a new president, President-elect Joseph Biden, Vice President-elect Kamala Harris, and certainly historical in the sense of being the first woman vice president, the first vice president who is African American and of Indian descent. So a very historical and interesting election, and one that we're preparing to delve in today. And so I think you will find this discussion very interesting. Dr. Williams, Dr. Marineau, welcome back.
Thank you very much. Glad to be back.
Thank you for having us.
Well, I appreciate you both taking time. I know it's a busy time, just shortly after Thanksgiving and in the final couple of weeks of the semester as you're working with your classes and getting ready for finals and so forth. Let me open with this general question for both of you. We'll start with you, Dr. Williams, and then Dr. Marineau, you can pick up. Give me your general reaction to the outcome of the November 3rd general election nationwide first. And well, let's just take it nationwide first to both of you. Then I'll come back with a Kentucky question. Dr. Williams.
Yeah, in our last broadcast, one of the things that you had us do is to make predictions, both about how big we thought the popular margin would be and what we thought the electoral margin would be. I thought that actually Biden was going to win by a little bit more, in part because I thought that the third-party candidates were going to have a little bit of a larger impact. I thought their vote share was going to be a little bit greater. And so I thought that Biden would get about 52% of the vote, but I thought his electoral college margin would be a little bit bigger. I was very surprised by Florida, to be perfectly honest. And we might talk later about the effectiveness of the Trump campaign, particularly in South Florida. But for the most part, I think most people generally expected that Biden would have a good showing. But because the margin of victory wasn't as large, the other side effect was that the Republicans did very well in the legislative races on the national level, much better than anybody was really expecting, I think. And so that to me was a bit of a surprise.
Dr. Marineau.
The outcome of the 2020 presidential election, it reminds me of last year's Kentucky election, where the Democrats took the governorship, but then lost basically every other race, and Republicans held every other state level office. This was like that at the national level, where the Democrats managed to win the presidency, not nearly by the landslide they were hoping for, as Dr. Williams alluded to, but Republicans actually did very well in just about every single other race. They took up a couple seats in the House. The Senate is still up for grabs. I'm sure we'll still talk about that. At state level elections, Republicans did very well. So I think the Republicans can look at the presidential loss as like a best case scenario. If you're going to lose the presidential election, this is about as good as they can hope for. President Trump got over 73 million votes, the most of any president. Of course, not as many as Joe Biden received. So Trump is in a very different position than George W. Bush was in 2008, where he is not an albatross. He's still seen as an asset for the Republicans. That's a very strong showing for the president, even though he didn't manage to win re-election.
Here in Kentucky, back to, well, Dr. Marineau, we'll start with you. Your comments very generally, and then we'll come back later to more detail. But your reaction to Kentucky election returns.
Well, McConnell won, of course. What was surprising to me was the margin of his victory. It's actually increased substantially over his last re-election campaign. His past several re-election campaigns had seen a diminishing level of margin of victory, but he managed to rebound. And that, to me, was surprising. I'm not sure that's because people found a new fondness for Senator McConnell, or perhaps his opponent just didn't attract them as much. But whatever the case, he did very well in his re-election campaign. Once again, Kentucky is a red state, so we see that in its voting on the presidential election. And we have a divided state government where we have a Democratic governor with a Republican-controlled Congress. And that's going to set up, I think, a challenging dynamic for the Democratic governor over the next several years.
Dr. Williams, same question. Kentucky election outcomes, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that Dr. Marineau's observation about how the presidential election was a lot like the election of 2019 in Kentucky, I think it was spot on. Let's be honest, the Democratic Party in Kentucky has some problems. And most of their problems are actually what's happening on the West Coast and the East Coast. Because effectively, all you have to do to run a successful statewide campaign, and even in most parts of the state, is just to say that I'm not a Democrat. I'm not like those people from California and New York. And that gets you 45% of the vote, and that's enough. And when you consider how Beshear won in 2019, he barely won a race against the man who is literally the least popular governor in the United States at the time that he ran for re-election. And I think that the election that we just saw here in 2020 just sort of reinforces the fact that unless state level Democrats can find some way of disconnecting themselves with the national party, or unless the national party sees it in their wisdom to tack in a different direction a little bit to help out the legislatures in rural states, I think the Republicans have Kentucky wrapped up for the foreseeable future, at least.
What were the keys to victory by the Joe Biden-Kamala Harris Democrat Party ticket at the national level? What would you think were the keys to victory overall? Dr. Williams?
I think that there are a couple of things that you could point to. But I think that the most important factor is going to be that Donald Trump is an extremely polarizing figure. There are a lot of people in America who absolutely adore and some who might even we go so far as to say worship Donald Trump. But a majority of Americans just simply don't like him and they don't like his style of politics, and they never have. There was never a point in the last 4 years of the Trump administration where his public approval rating got over 48%. And in fact, the most popular day of his presidency may very well have been the day that he lost it. And so I think that when you take this realization about Trump and how many people were going to the polls and not really saying we love Joe Biden, but saying we don't like Donald Trump, and then you then shift over and say, well, look what happened in the state legislative races or the national legislative races. Mm-hmm. And really the key to Joe Biden's success was that he wasn't Donald Trump. And that was enough to kind of carry him over the top in a lot of states.
Dr. Marineau.
I think without COVID, Trump would see a second term. The economy was going very well. He absolutely was a very polarizing figure. And so it would have been maybe a close victory, and maybe it would have been a replay of 2016 where it was a popular election loss and an electoral college win. At least without COVID, I think it would have been an even more close of a race. I think Trump would have pulled it out. We'll never know, of course. But the economy was going well, with COVID leading to an economic collapse, and also the federal response to COVID being lacking in a lot of ways. Mm-hmm. I think that also didn't help. But without COVID, I think we'd see a second term of President Trump, is my speculation.
We can only speculate on this next question. Could any of the Democratic candidates have won other than Vice President Joe Biden? Dr. Marineau.
That's a great question. And to my opinion, and my Bernie Sanders supporting friends will not like this opinion, is I don't think a left-leaning candidate like Sanders or Warren would have attracted those centrists who maybe there's not a whole lot of these people, but maybe they were open to supporting Trump and they were also open to supporting a Democratic candidate. I think a far left candidate would have made the Republican charges of socialism and defunding the police and these other kinds of ideas, it would have just made those charges stick all the more. Biden is a moderate. He does not support defunding the police. He's not a socialist. So those charges, even though the Republicans maybe tried it in various ways, it didn't have the same kind of traction that they would have had a more liberal candidate been running. So I think maybe a Buttigieg, maybe a more moderate Democrat would have been less vulnerable to those charges. But Biden is a known figure. He's popular with the African-American community. I think he was, for all of his downsides, I think he was their best shot at winning the presidency.
Dr. Williams, your thoughts on that same question?
Yeah, I think that's spot on, and I largely agree. The African-American community basically picked Joe Biden to be the nominee.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And when you look at how the primaries play out, I think that's essentially what happened. But the other thing that's true is that when you look at how the primaries played out, there was really never a point where the liberal wing, the more socialist wing of the Democratic Party, enjoyed a cumulative total of majority of the votes.
Right.
And if you can't win a majority of the Democratic Party, you're not going to win the presidential election. But to your specific question, actually, I do think so. I think there are probably 3 or 4 of the more moderate candidates, a couple of the female candidates. I would have been interested to see what Mayor Pete would have done had he ran for the presidency and received the nomination, because he would have been a much more energizing candidate than Joe Biden was. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, he might have cost you some votes in some of the more moderate states like a Pennsylvania or Wisconsin because of his personality. And so I'd be curious about him, but I definitely think that there were several other moderate candidates who could have had a real shot and maybe even done better because they'd have been a little bit younger, a little bit more youthful, that have had a little more dynamic campaign than Biden ran.
Obviously, Vice President Biden owes Congressman Clyburn and the black vote in South Carolina and subsequently in the Democratic primaries. And then I think the exit polls are showing us that the black vote was very strong and ran well ahead of that in most cases anyway, ran well ahead that of Secretary Hillary Clinton 4 years ago. Would you gentlemen agree? Either of you answer.
Yeah, I think so. There are pockets around the country where it looks like Donald Trump may have been a little bit successful, but you've got to keep in mind a little bit successful attracting the African-American vote means going from 10 or 11% to 11 to 12%.
Right.
Of the African-American vote.
Particularly among African-American males.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
He did increase his support there some.
And Latino males as well.
Yes.
Exactly.
Yes.
And so I think in those areas, there was some softening among minority support. But for the most part, I think that analysis is spot on.
What impact do you think Vice President-elect Kamala Harris had on the ticket, Dr. Marineau?
I think she energized the ticket. Joe Biden he did lack the enthusiasm that you saw like surrounding President Trump, for instance. There isn't that same kind of passionate following. I think Kamala Harris, it's, again, to make another analogy, it's sort of like McCain, Palin in 2008. Mm-hmm. McCain's campaign was, he was a known product. People liked him. He was respected, but they weren't really enthusiastic about him. Palin joins the ticket, and all of a sudden he's getting all these headlines and media invitations. I think it was something similar with Joe Biden, and you can see that concretely with their fundraising. You can track the day that they announced Kamala Harris's selection as the VP candidate. They received like the highest level of donations in months. So she definitely energized the ticket, and I think it was a very smart move on his part, both in terms of the demographics of course, being the first female vice presidential candidate, well, first female vice president, and also, attracting more folks from California, getting those kinds of wealthy donors as well. So I think her selection definitely had a very positive impact on his race.
Dr. Williams?
The thing that has struck me most, and this was something that happened on the Saturday after the election, because of the recount in Georgia and the changes in Pennsylvania, the swapping from Trump leading in Pennsylvania and Georgia and Arizona. It took a couple of days. But on Saturday, when the state of Pennsylvania was finally called, I was struck by the number of women, and especially the number of women of color, who had a very emotional reaction. And it caught me off guard, and it probably shouldn't have. And I started getting phone calls from students who, here at Campbellsville University, for the last several presidential inaugurations, we've taken a delegation to Washington, D.C. for the inauguration. And I had students calling me, asking me, are we going to go? Because not that they wanted to see Joe Biden, but they wanted to see Kamala Harris being sworn in as the first female woman of color, first biracial female, first Indian American female, all those things that they wanted to see her get sworn in. And I think that if that emotion that I saw the week after the election had also played a role in voting before the election, that might have been enough to carry a state like a Georgia or even in Arizona that Joe Biden might have potentially lost had it not been for an increase in the turnout among African Americans, especially African American women.
Why did the Democrat victory in the presidential race not result in victories down ballot? With noting what Dr. Marineau pointed out early on in the interview, the Republicans gaining seats in the House and possibly gaining a majority in the Senate with the pending Georgia Senate races, which we'll get to in just a moment.
And this is a question that the Democratic Party is negotiating more or less as we speak. And there's two competing narratives. The moderates blame the left-leaning candidates for attracting labels like socialism and blaming phrases like defunding the police as essentially verbal clubs that Republicans and Republican strategists could wield against them. So that's how the moderates are sort of arguing. They're saying they didn't do better because they could get the label socialist applied to them, and they didn't have a good response. For left-leaning Democrats, their responses have to do with AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, argued that the moderate Democrats didn't have a sufficient online presence, and they didn't invest enough in advertising on social media like Facebook. They also argue that not having a very strong left-leaning message didn't motivate people. And so their insinuation is if they just embraced a more kind of progressive agenda, it'll motivate more folks to come out and vote for Democratic candidates. And so then this is the dilemma for the Democratic Party, and they haven't sorted it out. And we'll see which faction ends up victorious in that debate.
I think that everything that Dr. Marineau has said, I don't disagree with any of that. I think that the Democratic Party has a geographic problem. When you look at how we divide power in our country, we allocate power based upon state, which is a geographic and we redistribute power on the basis of population every 10 years. But what we've got right now in the United States is that geographically, the Republican Party controls more physical territory. Now, what that means is that they have a hidden advantage in the Senate. They're going to have an advantage in most Senate seats, in most Senate races, just because of how the map plays out. And since they also have an advantage in who controls the state legislatures, they also have an advantage in terms of how we draw the legislative maps. So if you're running for a moderate district in a conservative controlled state, you're running against geography, you're running against culture, and you're running against gerrymandered districts. And this is going to make it hard for the Democratic Party to win the House. Now, asterisk next to that, we're finishing up the census. We're going to reapportion some seats. When we reapportion seats, that might fix some of the House problem. But a lot of the seats are going to go to a state like Texas, which, as we saw in this election, is not nearly as close to turning purple as Democrats think that it's going to be. The Democratic legislature is going to gerrymander all three of the new House seats that are going to be coming into the state of Texas after the census. And it creates an institutional disadvantage to the Democratic Party until the Democratic Party can find a way of talking to rural moderate voters in states like Kentucky. They're not going to be able to win the Senate, and they're going to have a tough time in the House of Representatives.
That is a good lead into the next question I wanted to throw out, and that is the importance of these two Senate seats in Georgia, both of which are runoff elections, meaning that neither seat, the leaders in both races, neither of them received a 50%. One of them was a special election with multiple candidates running, as allowed under Georgia law, and the other was a general election with Democrat and Republican nominees and some but other party candidates too. And the Senator Perdue, the Republican, was kept under 50%, thus a runoff. What is at stake here? with these two Senate races. Why all the attention on Georgia January 5th? Dr. Marineau.
Well, control of the Senate is up for grabs. If Democrats manage to pick up these two seats, they will have a 50-50 split in the Senate, with the vice president serving as the tie-breaking vote. So it would be a very different scenario. That means we would have unified government control, sort of like the first 2 years of the Obama administration. And that opens up a lot more, possibilities for the Biden administration to meet its policy goals. If Republicans maintain the Senate, it will mean that we have divided government. And that could mean that the ability for the Biden administration to function could be very obstructed. That similar to how the Republicans operated under President Obama. So concretely, that means judicial nominees may not get confirmed. There's question over whether the Senate will confirm some of the administration's cabinet appointments if they're not seen as centrist enough. So it means that we might see more continued obstruction in Washington, D.C. if Republicans maintain control of the Senate. If the Democrats can take it, that means they have a chance to maybe move forward on some of their policy priorities.
Dr. Williams, additional comments there?
Yeah, if you think about the major sales pitches that Joe Biden made, the things that I think there's actually popular support for. I think there's popular support for something like healthcare reform and for the expansion of Obamacare. Polls seem to suggest that. I think there's popular support for expansion of aid for college students. I think that polls suggest that. The Republican Party probably won't let any of those things happen. And to the degree that they might be able to be paid for. I mean, there's no way I could see the Republican Party allowing a tax increase to pay for healthcare expansion. I just don't see it happening. So if the Republican Party gains even one of those two seats, you may very well see the Supreme Court throw out, although it's unlikely, throw out something like Obamacare, but then have no way of replacing it with any kind of a meaningful reform or meaningful update. Now, again, I don't think that the Supreme Court's going to do that, but the entire Biden agenda is effectively on the line, which is certainly a problem for a president. When you walk into the door and on your first day, you're effectively a lame duck. It's going to be difficult for him.
The difference in controlling that Senate makes a monumental difference. Regardless, if the Democrats were to pick up both seats in Georgia, thereby, as Dr. Marineau said, and Vice President Harris, as of January 20th, casts the tie-breaking vote. Chuck Schumer replaces Mitch McConnell as majority leader. Even though they only control it by the vice president's vote, they control the rules. They control the committees. They control the process. And as Dr. Williams just explained for our viewers, that makes a big difference on appointments and the flow of legislation and so forth. And conversely, obviously, if Senator McConnell remains the majority leader, it becomes a major block to many initiatives of the Biden administration. Now, we're running out of time, and I should have scheduled a special segment for 1 hour. What is Donald Trump's future? Now, I know that is the one of the great subjects of much speculation on all the networks and from Fox News to MSNBC. But here on WLCU, we're going to discuss it. Does he run again in 2024? Does he start his own media empire? He's mad at Fox, I might note. So does he go to Newsmax and take over, start a Trump media empire? Does he return to his primary residence in Mar-a-Lago and run his business empire there? What does the future hold for Donald Trump? Dr. Williams.
I don't think that he's going to walk away. That's just not Donald Trump's style. And if you know anything about what it means to make a deal in business, it's that you don't take away a negotiation tool. So I think whether he runs for office again in 2024 or not, he's going to make people think that he is, if only so that he can use that threat as a way of maintaining some leverage over Republican legislators, and not just the national level, but also at the state level. My suspicion is that 4 years from now, he won't run. because he'll be 4 years older. And also because he's not just going to have to decide that he wants to run, but he's also going to have to decide that other people who've been working for him, someone like a Mike Pence, or even his own children, are going to have to continue to sideline their own careers for 4 more years. And then the 4 years after that, should he win re-election. And that's a big ask. And I'm not sure that Mike Pence would go that far with him. And if he decided to run against him, that'd be a real challenge. But I think he's definitely going to send every signal that he can, that he wants to retake the office, at least for the next 2 or 3 years.
Even speculation in recent days that he might announce his reelection on January 20th, the day of the inauguration for Joe Biden, and won't attend the inauguration. Dr. Marineau, same question.
I think we're going to see a president, or I guess an ex-president by that point, more engaged in contemporary American politics than we've seen in a long time.
Yes.
Usually when presidents leave office, they kind of go gently into the night. They set up their presidential libraries. They write books that sell millions of copies, like President Obama just has, and they go on very expensive book speaking tours and whatnot. I don't think we're going to see that with Trump, because he's in a very different position. I mean, it's a very unique situation. You think of other one-term presidents who failed to win re-election. The closest model would be Jimmy Carter, but Jimmy Carter gets very involved in humanitarian work. He doesn't really get involved in politics after losing his re-election in 1980. George H.W. Bush retires, Ford retires. I think we're going to see a new model of what a former presidential life looks like. I think he's going to be very involved in politics. I really appreciate Dr. Williams' point about this, using the threat, like the re-election threat, as leverage. I also agree. I don't think he's actually going to run again for re-election in 4 years, just because who can predict what happens in 4 years? But he's going to be involved in daily politics to an extent that we haven't seen, I think, ever. But at the very least, not since Jimmy Carter, in terms of him being a ongoing presence in our politics.
He certainly won't go back to Mar-a-Lago and close the door and simply run his business empire. Goes without saying. He will be a player to a large extent, and the major player for some time in the Republican Party. And I just saw a poll a few days ago that showed if he didn't run, obviously Vice President Pence would be the front runner at this point, but Donald Trump Jr. would be a close number 2. And everybody else would be far back: Marco Rubio, Ted Cruz, Cotton, and others that Senator Hawley from Missouri, and Ambassador, former governor of South Carolina, and Haley. So closing comments. We're down to just a few 30 seconds. So you're just closing thoughts, Dr. Williams, and then Dr. Marineau.
I think that to wrap up what we were just talking about with Donald Trump, I think that Donald Trump has transformed American politics for good or bad, and he's transformed the Republican Party for good or bad. And that we had a political system that found norms of behavior to be very important. And the Republican Party, as the conservative party, were the keepers of many of those norms, and those norms are now out the window. And Donald Trump threw them out the window when he moved in the White House, and is probably going to leave them outside whenever he walks away.
Dr. Marineau, closing thoughts?
I think we're going to be hearing from Donald Trump more over the next 4 years, more so than his detractors would have hoped.
Very much so. I would agree. Gentlemen, thank you for your time. And we will let me announce that a few months into the Biden administration, we will gather again and provide commentary on the first few months of the Biden administration, as well as congressional politics and Kentucky politics, and Donald Trump is and what he's doing at that point in time. This is John Channing for Dialogue on Public Issues, thanking our audience for watching and encouraging you to stay tuned to Washington and Frankfurt and all that is going on. There are many issues on the table.